Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Deutsche Bank. It's Europe's biggest investment bank and looks like it's in a whole lot of trouble, raising questions about the overall health of the financial system, which makes us wonder, 8 years on from the crisis that brought the global economy to a standstill, are the banks still too big to fail? Also this week, stamping out graft in South Korea. A new law there is sending shockwaves through the local business community. There's now a fine line to tread when wining and dining your guests if they happen to be a journalist, a teacher or a public servant. And we head to the Paris Motor Show, where it seems to be less about the car and more about the technology inside it, which could change the entire driving experience. When one of the world's foremost financial institutions calls you the world's riskiest bank, well, no need to explain that that's not good. But it is the position Germany's Deutsche Bank finds itself in right now, with that unenviable moniker coming courtesy of the IMF. Deutsche is Germany's biggest bank. It is Europe's biggest investment bank. And it's got problems, dating back to 2008, when it missold financial products known as Mortgage Backed Securities. Now, that is not a turn of phrase everyone's familiar with, but they were the very thing, the toxic financial instruments which brought the global economy to its knees 8 years ago. And now the US Department of Justice wants $14 billion back to settle civilian lawsuits related to the alleged mis-selling, a figure Deutsche Bank says it won't pay. Now, what could all this mean? Well, a fine that big would raise major questions over the solvency of Deutsche Bank. It posted record losses in the most recent financial year, and its market value has halved as shares sank. Also, there are new EU bail-in rules designed to protect taxpayers from the cost of failing banks. That means state aid is pretty much ruled out. Breaking the rules would be political poison for the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. And banking stress tests, which provide a check on how the biggest banks would fare in a severe market shock. Well, Deutsche's failed the last one of those. Doesn't look good, does it? But we've got a banking expert with us to explain the realities of the Deutsche Bank crisis. Chris Wheeler is in London, banking analyst at Atlantic Equities. And Chris, I was going to start by asking you, how did Deutsche Bank get itself into such a big mess? But I think the more pertinent question might actually be, how big a mess is Deutsche Bank actually in? You know, I guess I'm looking for a bit of perspective from you here, away from the big headlines which tout Deutsche Bank as, quote unquote, the next Lehman Brothers.
Look, I think that the work that's been done at Deutsche in the last couple of years means that it has actually a fairly solid balance sheet in terms of liquidity, in terms of its loan-to-deposit ratio. The problem it has is twofold, really. It's still trying to rebuild its earnings in markets that are not very favourable to it in investment banking. And the other problem, of course, is its capital. It has something called a 10.8% Common Equity Tier 1 ratio. That's kind of moderate compared to its peers, but obviously is under pressure if we have this very substantial US fine.
Quite right, we've got the fine, so let's talk about that. You've got the fine, you've got the shares falling to a near 30-year low, you've got the IMF calling it the world's riskiest bank as well. That is when you have to wonder about how bad it could get, and you start to think, well, maybe the fears people have are warranted.
Well, I think that the point is about capital. It's not about liquidity. Liquidity tends to be the thing that brings banks down. If you look back to banks like Lehman Brothers, Bear Stearns, they were brought down because they were almost wholly funded from the wholesale markets. Deutsche Bank has about 566 billion of deposits, and that's deposits from retail and commercial customers around the world, but obviously specifically in places like Germany, Spain and Italy. So it has a much stronger balance sheet.
But what about the problems surrounding this fine? As I understand it, the boss of Deutsche Bank, John Krein, is trying to turn this into a settlement rather than a fine. Now, to the everyday person, it might seem like, oh, well, it's the same thing because they'll still have to pay the money anyway. But I guess if it's worked out as a settlement, then they don't have to admit they actually did anything wrong because it's not a fine. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. It is a settlement they're chasing. That's what's occurred for the other big US banks who are involved in the mortgage-backed securities market. But it would also probably come with what we call a deferred prosecution agreement, something that HSBC has at the moment, Standard Chartered, for things they've done. And that means that you've got to pretty well behave yourself for 2 or 3 years, or the US regulator can come down on you like a ton of bricks.
And, you know, the fact that you've mentioned there some of those other big banks leads me to the idea that, and yes, this is the old phrase which we've heard so many many times, too big to fail, but that 8 years on from the start of the financial crisis, too big to fail is still around. And as unpleasant as it sounds, we might just have to accept that the big banks are that important. They can't fail.
Well, I think this has proved the point that too big to fail is still with us, because all the fear that gathered at the end of last week about Deutsche Bank and its prospects just reminded everybody that despite the fact that as balance sheets are much stronger, the regulators have forced banks to hold more capital, more liquidity. Despite all of that, if Deutsche Bank, and it won't happen, but if it was to, say, collapse in the mode of Lehman Brothers into bankruptcy, the ripples would be absolutely enormous, because it's a global bank and it has such an impact. So in a way, this is kind of a wake-up call to regulators. And in the US, there's been a lot of rhetoric around, how do we get rid of too big to fail? I think the answer is, I don't think you do.
Is there any doubt, though, that Angela Merkel and the German government wouldn't step in if it got to that Lehman Brothers stage?
I think that Angela Merkel does not want to step in. I think that there's an implicit guarantee to Deutsche Bank's funding at the moment, because people, the wholesale market, which is lending to Deutsche, not its retail customers, actually probably thinks Germany is standing behind it. But I think that Angela Merkel will want Deutsche Bank to try and solve its own problems. And that means if it does have to raise more capital, actually do a very deep discounted rights issue, which will be enormously dilutive to existing shareholders, but will get them into a position they can pay this fine and continue rebuilding the business.
I think it would almost be unthinkable, the idea that there would have to be some sort of bailout, wouldn't it? I mean, I guess I'm looking at it from taxpayers' point of view here. The outrage there would be that 8 years after we first learnt how bad this could get, it could still happen.
Well, I think we had a bail-in, a bailout, if you want, in Portugal last year of a large bank. So it has happened since the crisis. But I think the important thing here is under the new EU rules, governments can't step in and just put capital in the way, say, the UK did in Lloyds and Royal Bank, or Germany did with Commerzbank. You cannot do that without, first of all, effectively writing off 8% of your liabilities, which means effectively wiping out a lot of what we call your senior debtors, people like the big fund managers, PIMCO, BlackRock, etc., who invest in Deutsche's wholesale funding. So it's not straightforward. They just can't step in and put capital in.
So to your mind, does that mean that the regulation is working, that the tighter rules are working to a degree at least?
Yes, I think it does. And this is the big debate around Italy. Obviously, Italy would like to probably bail out one of its big banks, Monte dei Paschi, but it's precluded from doing that by the EU rules. They'd have to go through a much more painful mechanism, and a lot of the senior debtors in Italy tend to be individuals rather than institutional investors, so it makes it much more tricky. So I think we have got to the stage where people know what the mechanism is, but unfortunately, when markets start to move the way they did last week, governments sit there and say, do we have to step in and do something to make sure we stabilise our market and indeed the global economy?
Just finally, Chris, I mentioned this before, the IMF calling Deutsche the world's riskiest bank. Do you think that is a fair tag to put on them, or does it actually do potentially more harm to put a label on it?
Look, I think we have to face the fact that there's banks like JP Morgan, Citibank, who are considerably bigger in terms of the balance sheet they have deployed, for example, in derivatives. The problem with Deutsche Bank at the moment is its earnings power is being severely limited by being hit by fines, by the fact that capital markets, trading activities have been very sluggish for the last 2 or 3 years, and the fact that its cost base is far too high. So all of these things mean that while it's as big as some other competitors, its earnings power is less, and that makes it much more vulnerable. And we're seeing that with this worry around this US settlement.
Chris Wheeler, pleasure talking to you. Thank you for your time.
My pleasure.
The British pound was also a big focus this week after it sank to a 31-year low against the dollar. And there was an extremely volatile session on Friday as well, which saw it fall 6% in 2 minutes, a sort of a flash crash. Technicalities aside, though, the pound is being sold on fears of a so-called hard Brexit. Barnaby Phillips explains now.
Printing money is the easy part, as every government knows. Protecting its value, more difficult. British politicians like to talk about the pound in your pocket. Well, the real value of that pound has gone down since the referendum, some 15% compared to the US dollar. We have to go back to the Reagan-Thatcher years and May 1985 to find the pound this low against the dollar. And you can see on the far right of the graph the impact of the Brexit vote on June the 23rd. But it was the Prime Minister who provoked the latest sell-off of the pound when she outlined her Brexit plans in a speech on Sunday.
We are not leaving the European Union today to give up control of immigration again. And we're not leaving only to return to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice.
In other words, she'll take a hard line in negotiations with the EU. Inside the hall, her supporters cheered, but outside, many take this as a sign that Britain will eventually be forced out of the European single market, making the pound less attractive.
There's a concern that banks and financial institutions might lose their financial passport, which enables them to operate across borders. And I think there's also concern that companies that do business across borders between the UK and the EU could face disruption to their supply chains. So there's two factors, I think, weighing down on the pound at the moment as a result of these concerns about a hard Brexit.
But the paradox in the City of London is that as the pound sinks, the stock exchange soars. Many companies on the FTSE 100 make most of their money in dollars. So, because of the currency fluctuations, their earnings are now worth more in pounds. Despite the big fall in the pound, there's actually widespread relief here in the City of London and in the UK generally over how the British economy has performed since the referendum. The immediate shock, which many had predicted after a Brexit vote, never actually happened. But it will only be after we have a clearer idea of the actual terms of Brexit that we'll know how damaging or not it will be for the British economy and for the wider European economy.
And still ahead on counting the cost till tax do us part. Why happy couples in China are divorcing because of government efforts to prevent a housing bubble. That story's still to come. First, though, a new law in South Korea, which is aimed at cutting high levels of corruption. Limits are being imposed on government staff, journalists and others on how much can be spent on gifts and other entertainment. Harry Fawcett has the story from Seoul.
For decades in South Korea, the sound of club head-on ball has chimed with the sound of business being done. Personal relationships are vital, and businesses have spent freely on treating government officials, journalists and others to lavish meals, nights out and days on the fairways. But as one former golf course boss describes, the line between relationship building and bribery was often ignored.
People bet on golf in all imaginable ways. A businessman may offer the prize money of $1,000 on top of paying for all the expenses so that his clients can win the money and have an enjoyable day.
A parliamentary audit released in the last few days found that South Korean companies spent more than $9 billion on entertainment last year. The top 1% of companies alone spent more than $3 billion. It's a practice that doesn't just grease the wheels of industry, it's become an industry in itself. From this week, a new law has come into force. Business meals aren't banned, but they are now capped at less than $27 per person. Gift sets bought with company money must come in under 50,000 won, or about $45. Wedding and funeral donations under $90. It's thrown South Korea's PR industry into a spin as people try to work out how to do business without breaking the law. Among the questions asked at this preparatory session, could clients still drink champagne at a wine tasting event? But a lot of entertaining is done in much more private settings, so-called room salons like this one, where we film secretly. Corporate nights out often end in places like this, which frequently provide illegal sexual services. We're told euphemistically that some of the girls are wilder than others. In his former job, Kim Yong-bin was in content creation for public bodies. He says he'd frequently have to treat officials to nights out, and they were specific in what they expected.
Sometimes they would demand that we spend up to $1,800 per head. The money is being spent on drinking, eating, and also other entertainments.
I ask if that means prostitution.
I can't say that it was infrequent.
The new law is likely to have an immediate impact on businesses like this. The CEO of this course says corporate entertainment accounts for half of its bookings. The bigger question is whether the new rules of play will be adhered to, or whether companies will just find new ways to bend and break them.
To the Paris Motor Show now, which, historically speaking, was the first ever motor show in the world. This year, though, it's all about the future, and a future which goes well beyond 4 tyres and a gear stick. In Paris, many of the attendees and some of the bosses of the biggest car companies were actually predicting the end of motoring as we know it. A fundamental change is underway given the advent of the self-driving car and connected cars, to the point where the steering wheel itself could become a thing of the past. So let's talk to someone at the sharp end of that technological revolution in cars. Joining us from the Paris Motor Show is Luca De Mayo. He's the CEO of the Spanish car company SEAT, which is part of the Volkswagen Group. You know, Luca, I've been reading about SEAT, not a brand I was terribly familiar with, I will admit, but I notice your slogan, which is technology to enjoy. Clearly, you're not just about driving a car, are you? You want to take it further than that.
I mean, we are a Southern European brand, so I think the market expects from a Southern European brand some kind of emotion and flair, and that's what we have been doing in the last years, and I think the new technology will give us even more chances in the future.
Well, tell me about that new technology. What is your focus? How far do you want to take it? Because, you know, look, I personally, I love technology, but I also think there's a time and a place for it, and I don't know whether the car is always the right environment for all of that connectivity.
Yeah, I mean, there are three fundamental trends in the industry going on right now. You have the electrification part, you have the autonomous driving, and you have the connected car. Clearly for us, our choice and our focus will be on the connected car because we believe that putting our product, hardware, into digital, in the middle of the digital world and creating an ecosystem will give us chances to provide to the consumer a completely different experience, something he can enjoy, he can relax and take advantage of.
And are you sure the consumer actually wants that? You know, we are connected everywhere now. We're stuck to our smartphones all day. We've got our smart TVs and we've got our tablets and we've got our computers. What do we really need in the car?
I think our focus is very clear, is to make as exactly what you're saying is that life is getting very complicated for people. So I think we want to position ourselves as the manufacturer that makes the experience as easy as possible, and technology will allow us this. So I think that the car, an intelligent product connected with the infrastructure, with the retail, etc., will provide exactly what they need, which is an easy experience.
Yes, but can you give me some specific examples for our viewers who might, you know, wonder? I think particularly our viewers who are outside of Europe and haven't heard of SEAT before. I wonder if you could explain what sort of things they could expect from one of your cars, connectivity-wise.
I mean, I give you an example. If you just want to, let's say, reserve a parking half an hour before because you want to go exactly in that parking, you will be able to do it with the connected car. This is just an example, but there are many things that we can do, or, you know, where the car with kind of deep learning and navigation system, etc., will kind of relieve from stress. From the stress of the complicated mobility experience that we have right now. Accessibility to different products when you want to do car sharing. I mean, all these things will be possible now that the car is kind of communicating and transferring data.
And a very basic question here, but do you genuinely think this will help sell more cars? You know, sales across Europe are at their lowest or slowest levels for 2 years. Buying a car is a major financial investment. Do you think this is what will get people heading back to their car dealerships?
Look, when I talk about collector car, I always use an example, which is the example of Apple, when Apple moved the iPod to the iPhone. That's the kind of effect that this could have on the industry. I mean, for, you know, as we were mentioning about you know, how the market is going. In our markets, in our main markets, the European market is actually going up, so we are taking advantage of it. So countries like Spain, Italy, France, Germany are doing very well, and I believe that we as a manufacturer need to provide to consumer a reason, you know, to get back into our showrooms and buy a new car. And the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years will be one of the, you know, most incredible times in the automotive industry since decades. So I think there will be a lot of reasons.
What about, well, you said there were 3 things, didn't you? There were electric cars, automated cars, and connected cars. Are you interested in the automation at all? Because this seems to be the big thing. You know, you read the news these days and you're always hearing about the latest self-driving car technology.
I mean, we think that this is pretty much of an expensive technology because it requires a lot of hardware, unlike the connected car is more of a software story. So I think for a customer like SEAT, which is very careful, in terms of pricing, I think will not be a front runner into the thing. The great advantage that we have is that we are part of the Volkswagen Group, is investing a lot, especially the premium brands. So we'll be able to pick up some of the technology. I am personally convinced that autonomous driving for SEAT will be in the first step related to the way this kind of technology will improve safety, because this, I think, is very relevant for consumers. So autonomous driving by SEAT is to kind of bring a super safety concept in the market.
You mentioned the Volkswagen Group there. Have things improved at Volkswagen? Do you think that they're getting the trust of the customers back after the emissions scandal? Because there's no doubt that was a very big hit to the parent company.
Look, of course, you understand. I'll be able only to comment on the SEAT case. In our case, we actually had in the first semester 2016 our best semester in the history. So I think we were able, despite this kind of an unfavorable product life cycle, we were pretty much on track. And now we are looking at with optimism at the next months, because we have just launched the Ateca, the compact SUV, which is very successful, and we'll be launching in the next 12 months other 3 new models, including another small SUV. So we look at 2016 with optimism, so the growth will continue, and 2017 will be a very special year for SEAT.
So you're optimistic then about the economic environment as well, not just about the car business or your brand within VW, but the actual economic conditions, because those economic conditions obviously have to be strong for people to want to buy a car and invest that sort of money.
I mean, I'm not an economist, so I cannot forecast economy trends. What I can tell you is that we have all the tools and all the initiative in place to make sure that SEAT, despite the waves into economics, will continue to grow. We are pretty optimistic about the potential that we have, because we never had so many products at the same time in the history of SEAT. So I think it can only go up for us.
Luca Di Maio from SEAT Cars. Thanks for joining us on Counting the Cost. Finally this week, love and marriage, or in this case, property and divorce. We're in Nanjing, China, where there's a new law limiting the number of properties a married couple can own. So what's the solution? Apparently it's to split up. Our China correspondent Adrian Brown has more.
Some strange things are happening in China's property market. Towns and cities filled with empty apartment blocks, reminders of a slowing economy. Yet the rush to buy seems to be accelerating. And in some cases, it's turning to panic. Buyers swarm into a real estate office in Hangzhou. The door can't withstand the crush. They wanted to get ahead of a new rule banning those born outside the city from owning more than one home. This anonymous building in nearby Nanjing is the Civil Affairs Bureau, where marriages officially end. But not everyone here is divorcing for real. Some are cutting ties, at least on paper, so they can buy homes as 2 singles instead. A few even bring along their children. Stevie and JJ only married in May. Their legal separation took just 15 minutes.
Are you sad?
No, I'm not sad.
Because it's not a real divorce.
Yeah.
From a shopping bag, JJ produces the 2 booklets that confirm their old and now new status.
Does this mean that money is more important than love?
No, we're in love. We're still in love.
Official figures show a 2-fold increase in Nanjing's divorce rate compared to a year ago.
Property prices in some of China's big cities began rising steeply several months ago. It followed intervention by the government. To try to revive sagging economic growth, banks were told to lower interest rates. The result is that cheap money has rarely been more readily available.
Some economists warn that this kind of debt-fueled growth can be dangerous. But with the savings rates offered by banks so low and the stock market still too unpredictable, many Chinese people are returning to property. Outside Beijing, more new upmarket homes. Chaperoned by eager sales agents, these prospective buyers don't seem concerned about buying into this overheating market.
I bought a flat early this year. It's more than doubled in value. Doubled. You can't buy any more. And this place will go up in value as well.
Back in Nanjing, Stevie and JJ seem happy about the divorce. They say they plan to continue living together and to remarry once they've secured their second home.
And that is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. You can tweet me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do. Or just drop us an email. CountingTheCost@aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.